Hey, I'm David Liggett with Data Center Hawk, and I am so excited to be joined by Dan Scarborough, our lead analyst in Europe. Dan, it's great to be with you. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'm excited to catch up.
Yeah, hi David. It's nice to be here, and I'm kind of Europe extending into Asia now, which is also very exciting.
That's right, and that's what we're talking about today. The AsiaPac data center market, and there's obviously a lot of things happening in that region of the world. One of the things we're really excited about at Data Center Hawk is continuing to grow our kind of data coverage and market analysis that we do, and Dan Scarborough for us is right in the middle of all of that. And so today we're going to hit on what is happening in the Asia-Pac region of the world from a data center perspective. And so, Dan, one of the first things I wanted to do was ask you from your perspective to provide a good framework of how the major and secondary markets work in that part of the world. And I'll like to do it like this. In the U.S., as an example, we have some bigger data center markets like Northern Virginia, Chicago, Phoenix, Dallas, Northern California. I know in Europe, we have what are called the FLAP D markets, which is Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin. And so from your perspective, what are like the big markets in Asia from a data center standpoint, and what are some of the emerging markets that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think the Asian market is even more culturally diversified than Europe.
Interesting.
And I think there are sizable markets in Asia that are operating almost in isolation because of the cultures that they represent and they reflect. And I'm excited about the work that we've been doing to kind of unlock the keys to some of those markets. And some of the ones that we're releasing on the platform sooner and later are Singapore, Sydney, and Hong Kong. And they've got three different, relatively different nuances. They're all significant markets within the scope of the Asian markets. Japan is another large market in Asia with Tokyo and Osaka, and China with Shanghai, Beijing, and the tier 2 China markets as well has got a significant amount of capacity. On top of that, we're seeing kind of increasing amounts of capacity in the rest of Southeast Asia. So Jakarta in Indonesia, there seems to be growth in Jakarta. Also in Vietnam and Thailand, we're seeing some activity over there. And then finally, or not finally, but India as one of the markets that would fit into that kind of part of the world. There's been significant activity in India, and we're forecasting a huge amount of growth there over the coming years, which is obvious by some of the announcements that we've been seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the supply challenges that you see in that part of the world, in the Asia-Pac region? We occasionally see some of that in the U.S. related to, hey, can you get power online quickly? Are there issues with like infrastructure and things like that? But what are some of that you see? Talk about that in Asia-Pac.
Well, I think the challenges are very much market specific. So if you look, for instance, at Singapore, there has been a moratorium on new data center construction in Singapore for some time now. The government is being quite strict on approvals that they're making for new sites. That's tied down to kind of renewable energy and climate change, and making sure that any new data centers have got equivalent amounts of renewable energy to that they're taking from the grid. In a location like Singapore, that can be quite challenging because it's a small country. So the amount of construction in Singapore compared to how it has been historically is has dried up or is significantly lower. There is a higher occupancy rate in Singapore as a result of that.
Sure.
There's also challenges that we're seeing in terms of the construction process and the cost of materials that has been partly by the pandemic and the supply chain issues. So there seems to be a significant increase in the price of materials for those people that are building sites at the moment. So that's kind of a bit of a snapshot into Singapore. The Sydney market, or Australia in general, is a growing market. It's definitely benefited from some of the slowdown in Singapore. It's well connected with some significant investments over the last few years in submarine fiber, and we have seen a fair amount of activity in Sydney and other parts of Australia. The interesting thing about that capacity is it's quite zonal and based on being in the right availability zone or stock for the customer's requirements. Hong Kong as a region has gone through its change in perception over the last couple of years since becoming a bit closer to China than it has been historically. It's been harder to kind of source the relevant information from Hong Kong, but it's still a very buoyant market. It's quite reliant on China from a power perspective. The cost of power seems to be relatively expensive in Hong Kong compared to other locations. These are some of the trends that we've been seeing.
Yeah, I think you pointed out some really good ones that I think are not just happening in Asia, but they're happening in other places, and they're having tremendous impacts on the market today. One obviously is, and I would just, if you're listening to this our podcast discussion and you're trying to understand like, hey, what are the trends shaping the market? I mean, one of them is this supply chain challenge and how companies will continue to work themselves out of that. In certain areas we haven't seen that be as big of an impact from a supply standpoint, but in others we have, and that's just that's kind of the results of where we've been over the last 12 to 18 months as from a global standpoint. The second thing I think that is really interesting is as the challenges related to like delivering power infrastructure continue to pop up in certain areas, that will push some of the demand to other places. And I think you mentioned that like related to Singapore right now. We've seen some of that stuff happen in some other countries and some other markets, even in the U.S. So it's always interesting to me to kind of watch, hey, what markets will be the areas that actually like land additional capacity or requirements because there are some of those supply challenges.
Yeah, and I couldn't. I 100% agree. I mean, if you think about the Singapore market, I think it depends on when you started any market. It depends on where you are in your construction program, right? But the challenge is then trying to make sure from a pricing perspective, your profitability as an operator is reflected in your pricing, and it then affects how fast you build things out.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can't necessarily build it out as quickly or as speculatively if the costs are slightly higher. So we've certainly seen that. I think Indonesia is a really interesting market. There's been some changes in data policy in Indonesia more recently that has allowed the market to open up. The population in Indonesia is significant. The population in some of these locations in Asia is way above what you would expect in equivalent markets in Europe. Yep. And that's certainly driving the desire for the traditional customers to be in those locations and to expand their capacity. So that's some of the stuff that we've seen. I mean, I think Singapore as a strategic location, as an Asian hub for the market, is not going away.
Yep.
I think Hong Kong is, not only strategically important given its position in Asia, but it's also a strategic location as a gateway into the China market. So each one of the countries and their locations have got their own kind of nuances that need to be reflected when you're analyzing them.
You mentioned the growth from some of like the normal customers. We've seen hyperscale customers continue to grow in markets across the world over the last 12 to 24 months. We also are seeing like enterprises grow as well, and the dynamics there. So I'd love to understand from your standpoint. I want to break those two down. specifically related to Asia and how they are acting in those markets. So let's first talk about the hyperscale companies. So if you're just listening to this or you're joining us for the first time, we typically there's typically about 20 to 30 companies across the world that are driving these really big data center requirements. We refer to them as hyperscale customers. They need large scale capacity. They need flexibility in what they do, and speed to market is really valuable. And I would say especially in international markets. And so, Dan, from your perspective, are these companies in Asia, are they building, owning, and operating their sites first? Are they actually trying to lease sites first? Like, what's the behavior with some of those larger hyperscale companies?
Yeah, I think there's certainly I think there's a mixture of the two. There's certainly an investment in the subsea fiber. There's 2 subsea fibers that are being coming online as a result of investment from hyperscale operators. I think they're definitely earlier in their journey in Asia than they are in the US and Europe. We're seeing.
And why do you think that is? Why do you feel like they're earlier there than some other places?
I think the vast size and scale of some of these markets, like for instance India, has meant that they're having to develop an independent strategy for some of these larger locations.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also certainly more competitive in Asia for the Western hyperscalers, given the dominance of the more traditional Eastern hyperscalers, the BATs. Yep. Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent. Their amount of capacity that they're developing in that region seems to be significant. There seems to be a split as well in terms of where that capacity is landing. So you've got operators in for instance Asia that have got ownership aligned to the Chinese companies that are taking a significant amount of that capacity, and then you've got other capacity which is not necessarily as aligned to that ownership structure that's going to the operators with more Western ownership structures.
Sure.
So I think the battle there's definitely the battleground in Asia is probably is more competitive than it is in maybe the US and Europe for the traditional Western hyperscale operators. I also think that they are more and more, we're seeing a lot of build to suit activity. So we're seeing a lot of activity from the colo market. There's definitely a new breed or a kind of a different breed of colo operators that have sprung up in the last few years, the hyperscale colo operators, right, that are focused on delivering capacity to hyperscale customers. So you've got the kind of the air trunks of the world that is kind of their key model. There is a lot of competition for that capacity, but there are some big deals that are being, or relatively big deals. There was not an insignificant amount of capacity at the end of last year in Sydney for one of the colo operators. So there's that spare capacity is being absorbed in a strong way, as can be seen in the other markets.
And how are those companies looking at renewable energy? What's the renewable energy story like in the AsiaPac region?
I think they're definitely focused on energy efficiency, and I think that there is a big move towards energy efficiency by some of the operators. We've spoken to companies like Princeton Digital, based out of Singapore, that have got a big foothold in China as well. They've got some very noteworthy sustainability credentials, as do companies like Keppel. There are lots of operators, I think, are pushing for that kind of move towards renewable energy. We're seeing a lot of that in Singapore with the moratorium. Australia has just invested 52 billion in the move towards kind of renewable and removing its reliance on on coal-fired power plants, but they're earlier in that journey than say Europe. But I think we're seeing that everywhere. I think the pressure that the customers are placing, especially the North American customers are placing on ensuring that the capacity that they're procuring is from renewable sources isn't any different in Asia than it is in the rest of the world. They just don't always have access to, the same amount of renewable capacity that they might do in Europe, for instance.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk about the enterprise market for a minute and just the dynamics around, financial companies, healthcare companies, and how they're looking at the market. I was on a previous podcast yesterday where we were talking about, certainly in the U.S., we've seen an increase in activity from a demand standpoint from companies like that over the last, 90 days or so. Do you feel like we're seeing the same type of thing in Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a, it's a very entrepreneurial culture in Asia. We're seeing, growth in the kind of fintech, medtech kind of businesses that are, the newer organizations with the kind of AI-based workloads and kind of HPC-based workloads. That seems to be certainly some of the capacity that we're seeing, some of the take up that we're seeing. So yes, I would say that the market isn't fully dominated by the hyperscale, but you do certainly have a lot of whale hunting going on, for want of a better description.
Yep. How do you feel like new technologies are impacting that part of the world? Especially I would say with the amount of population, you mentioned that are in some of those markets, but as 5G continues to roll out, obviously as edge type of data centers solutions are being delivered to the market. I mean, how are some of those technologies and maybe new infrastructure deployments impacting the opportunities in that part of the world?
I mean, I think that there's definitely an edge play going on, a significant edge play. I think that the edge model is being kind of considered as a route to deploying capacity in new markets quickly. And that seems to be something that a few of the operators are working on. There's definitely a high level of mobile adoption across all of Asia. And I don't think it's something that is specific to that market, other than that the captive audience that you've got in those locations is way above what you've got in Europe. There seems to be a lot of joint ventures and partnerships, working in India. We've seen the announcement through EdgeConnect's and Adani. Microsoft are working with Reliance in India. So there seems to be a bit more of a joint venture approach in locations like India, because they're, some challenging markets to operate in. The same in Japan. Japan is a bit more of a challenging market to operate in. So some of the commercial relationships seem to be a bit more joint venture based. There's definitely a move towards, huge amounts of capacity. I mean, I was talking to one guy about the China market, and when you think about China, you kind of focus on the tier one markets, the Beijing, Shanghai, but there are like 13 other cities which are tier two with over X million population, which got a requirement for additional capacity. And it's easier to do business in those locations because there isn't the pressure of the real estate prices. Data center industry isn't as well known.
Yep.
I think that the challenge is not dissimilar to the challenges that you see in any location, getting the right asset at the right price with the right power availability, that could be deployed at the right timescales, is what these guys do day to day. And we're seeing organizations that are focused on working in different geographical locations. The delivery time seems to be very fast. I mean, some of the companies that we've been talking to, the time that they're building it is like ridiculously fast. There are quite a few of the organizations as well have got very specialist engineering firms. It's a different climate over there, so you're dealing with different challenges from a climate perspective. It's not temperate. It's certainly more challenging when it comes to cooling and that side of things. So it's a very exciting, diversified market, and I'm really excited that we've started covering it, and I'm looking forward to kind of continuing to provide information on what's going on.
Right on. Well, Dan, thank you again for your feedback and your expertise in that area of the world. It's fun to get to work with you alongside you in this venture, and excited about the information and expertise you'll be delivering down the road.
Thanks a lot, David. Take care of yourself.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more, you can get on datacenterhawk.com. Check out our Insight platform. That is where all of this information is coming to. So that's where you can get the information on areas like Singapore, Sydney, Hong Kong, London, Frankfurt, Northern Virginia, Chicago, Phoenix, all those markets. It's right there. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon.